What kind of high-level description would you give local versus universal dichotomy?
It may have been the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, who said, "Great minds discuss ideas. Average minds discuss events. Small minds discuss people." Now, it's a terrible thing to say. It's a horrible sentiment. I don't believe in that at all. And I think it's practically racism. Not quite racist. It's prejudice. It's prejudice once you actually realize how people work. Because intelligence has nothing to do with interest. And some people are just more interested in people. Some people are more interested in things, and some people are more interested in concepts, ideas, and models. And that has nothing to do with intelligence. But people generally associate intelligence with what we call universal. So Eleanor Roosevelt, supposedly said that thing about ideas, events, and people. So of these three things, ideas would be the most universal, and events and people would be pretty local. But really at a high level, what universal means is if something is universal, it can be applied to more things and it's less useful. If something is local, it can be applied to less things, but it's more useful. So, let's think of an example.
How would you
here.
define useful in this context? Yeah.
It's more applicable.
Okay.
It has higher utility when you act as if it is true. Here's a really great example. Men are taller than women. Now, that's a very universal claim because you're applying that claim to all roughly, 3.5 billion men and all roughly 3.5 billion women. It's a very broad, wide claim that is extremely widely applicable. So its application is extremely large, that claim, that truth. But its usefulness or level of truth on individual circumstances is not as good. So there's plenty of women who are taller than plenty of men. So in an individual circumstance, if Susan is 5'10 and John is 5'8, the statement men are taller than women is not true. It's generally true because it's true on average. So it's a universal statement that is highly useful on averages. It's very applicable to many different cases, but it's not as useful in individual circumstances.
Okay.
So that's the universal claim, right?
Right.
And now the local claim would be something like Sally is taller than John. Now, what can I use that information for? Almost nothing. I know that Sally is taller than John, and it's 100% true and extremely applicable to the situation. But I can't really infer anything else from it. It's hyper-specific truth that is highly useful in a very particular circumstance, but not others at all. It has no use outside of that circumstance. So in the first example, that was universal truth. It's highly applicable, very useful across broad swaths of the population. But as you go into more micro situations, it can definitely be like false, or it's not false, but it's not as useful in those particular circumstances.
Another example would be the claim that Toyotas have trouble with their power windows. That's a broad statement that could apply to a lot of cars, but if your Toyota doesn't have problems with its power windows, then that statement is completely useless to you. But it could be useful on a broader level to, say, a car components manufacturer. Universal statements are useful, but like you said, they're useful on the grand scale. They're not necessarily always useful on the individual scale.
And another thing I'd like to add is just general things like models and ideas. We call them universal because they are applicable across a lot of different things, but they're not anywhere close to perfect. So generally, if if the truth applies to lots of different things, it's going to be less accurate. But it's nice to use because, I can use this truth across many different things. This is a useful nugget everywhere, but there's a lot of caveats involved. Or you can have a truth that's very specific to one situation. It's way more reliable per situation that it applies to, but it only applies to one situation instead of a billion. So just saying the same thing over again, pretty much.
I got into a bit of a discussion with a friend of mine who's an SFP just the other day. I won't go into the details of it because it's off topic, but it was interesting. The discussion was, are farms good or bad for water quality? And his stance was no, it's the cities that are doing it. And my stance was the cities are doing it too, but so are the farms. But every time I try to give an example, I wasn't being very good at giving a local example. And I'd give generic statements that he could disprove or he could refute by giving a local example of how that wasn't the case. So I'd say something along the lines of cattle farms produce a lot of manure that goes into the water. And then he could say something like, well, my uncle owns a cattle farm and they're very clean and they don't get any manure in their water. So a situation like that, I think, demonstrates the difficulty of the universal local divide, because in my mind, that's a terrible point. Like, okay, one farm, that's great.
Yeah.
But in his mind, my point is a terrible point because he's seen direct evidence otherwise.
Yeah. So at this point, I think we should have a disclaimer because I'm going to start being really biased. It's hard for me not to be. The disclaimer that me and Alex are both very universal, right, Alex?
Yes.
And I would go so far as to say for myself, I am universal to the extent that I am practically mentally disabled. It's really bad, like really bad for me. I can't even communicate properly. And when I hear this kind of argument that you're talking about with your friends, I'm just thinking, oh my God, obviously, you're saying farms are good for water, or farms are better for water quality?
Basically, farms aren't bad for water quality.
Farms aren't bad for water quality. And he says, that's not true. I know a farm that's bad for water quality. Like, that's insane. Those two things have nothing to do with each other.
No, he's saying
I literally have had this,
that the farm he knows of isn't bad for water quality. So that based on that, farms aren't bad for water quality.
But you're disagreeing with him, right?
Yes, because I'm saying farms are bad for water quality.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, I got your guys' opinion switched up. It doesn't really matter. So I've literally had these same kinds of conversations with people, and it's just like I can't even speak because I'm dumbfounded at how dumb the argument appears to be. For instance, this is an example, but just going back, I'll be like, men are taller than women on average, and they'll be like, nah, Sally's taller than John, and I'll be like, what? I don't even know. Like, there's no room for us here to like have a conversation anymore because what you just said is insane. So now you're starting. Hopefully, the audience gets to understand what it's like as a universal person and what it's like as a local person. Local people will generally probably like think, oh, this guy's so impractical. He's got his head in the clouds. He's not thinking about real life. That kind of thing, right? That's kind of how they feel when they're talking to a universal person, right?
Like his basically his point of view, and going back to this discussion I was having, was how could I be saying that farms are bad for water when it's very obvious that most of the problem is from the cities? And I didn't necessarily disagree with him on cities being bad, but that was basically the crux there. At the end of the day, I think it was a issue with communication.
Mm-hmm.
So going back to your example with Sally being taller than John, I think the problem comes more in the way a universal would make the statement of men are taller than women. I think one way I've been able to get around these kind of communication mistakes is saying basically the way you said it, in that men on average are taller than women, or more men are above a
Yeah.
certain height than women. Basically adding these qualifiers that let the other person know that you're speaking in very general terms. Because I think without those qualifiers, it's easy for a local person to be like, that might be true sometimes, but it's definitely not true right now. So, hello, you know? Like,
yeah. And I think those terms, general and average, those are terms generally associated with universal things, because it implies that there are multiple units or nodes or whatever, multiple widgets, and then you're making an abstraction, or you're making like an average of them. So to bash my universalness a little bit, to be fair, as an example, let's say I am working on a car with a local person. The local person's going to be better at me with the car. He's just helping me with my car. And I'm kind of like, I'm a little curious about how whatever we're working on the car, how it actually works. And so I'll be asking universal questions. So like, let's say we're working on the actual engine, and I'm like, internal combustion engines, how do they work? And I'll be like, so engines can have like 4 cylinders or 8 cylinders or even 12 cylinders. And he'll be like, your car only has 4 cylinders, Colby. What are you talking about?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, maybe that's a bad example. Maybe I'm bashing the local person again. Anyways, this is where my mind goes. As soon as I'm learning something, even if it's completely local circumstance. So like they're saying, when you were fixing your car, when you're climbing this rock wall, Colby, you should have put your hand here instead. And I immediately start thinking about the principles behind that. Immediately. I go, why is that?
Mm-hmm.
And when you say why, you're going up that chain. When you say why, you're going up.
Mm-hmm. And
when you go up, when you're chunking up, you're getting to a more broad area. Why always leads to more universal. And so whenever someone says something to me, even if it's hyper specific, Colby, when you're rock climbing, you should have put your right hand on that piece instead of the other piece. And I think, why? And I say, back to the person who's training me or whatever, I think, because I had my weight placed too far to the left and I needed to move my right hand.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's better to keep like your center of gravity like closer to your hands on this axis or whatever. And they're like, I don't know what the hell you're talking about, Colby. I just told you to put your hand on that rock because it would have worked better.
Uh-huh.
Like, it doesn't matter. Like, that's what you should have done. Stop. You're in the middle of climbing a rock wall. Why are you you're trying to like extrapolate into the future and figure out what the principles are here.
Right. And it's not that a local person would dissuade you from doing that, but I could definitely see them saying, worry about this later. This is not the moment.
Yeah. And they might be impatient. They might, be upset even at that a little bit.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Some of them, certainly not all.
Yeah. That leads to what I was going to say, that this is the most extreme example of local, I think. As we've talked about in previous episodes, every person has local functions and universal functions, which we'll get into more in a minute. But that means that every local person is capable of being universal, and every universal person, except for maybe Colby sometimes, is capable of being local. So if you're sitting at home and you're thinking, I ask why all the time, so I must be universal, that may be the case, but that also may not be the case. And we'll be looking into why that's so in a little bit.
Okay, I'm sorry, I know that we've spent so much time on this. I just want to say one quick thing. Why always has an answer that is more universal than the subject. How always has an answer that is more local than the subject.
That's good. I like that.
I think, right?
Yeah.
I think that's true.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because how always chunks down.
Yeah. And why goes up.
Mm-hmm. Question. Why do you think your universalness is to the point that you're disabled? Could you clarify what you mean by disabled in this context?
Sure. Because in my assessment, the world needs roughly 1,000 more local people than it does universal. For every very universal person, there should probably be 1,000 very local people. And the reason for this is self-evident. universal principles and truths, which I think about a lot, are highly applicable to a broad swath of units, nodes, whatever. But they are not individually highly useful or beneficial. So I'm good at coming up with principles that are good for local people to be like, oh, okay, let's look at this principle. Colby invented this principle, and this applies to like a million different things fairly well. Oh, and that kind of helped me figure out this thing. Now I'm going to discard this principle and work on this local thing. Like, reality is local. And universal things are just made up to make life easier. And basically, there's more local things than there are universal things.
Yeah.
Like, local things are bigger.
No, it's true. Almost everything you do on a day-to-day basis is dependent on being able to do something on a local level in some way or another. So if you're a person who is very, very universal, you may struggle more in doing the day-to-day things than your average individual.
Exactly. And so basically, I'm more universal than reality would find useful. So I should probably be in a field like philosophy or, economics or something like that. Of course, you don't need a bunch of philosophers or economists. We could probably use some more. That'd be great, but we don't need as many of those as we do of other people.
Can you think of a concrete example of how we've mentioned a little bit in like communication issues with local people, but can you think of an example that isn't necessarily interpersonal that could be an issue for someone who's very universal?
I mean, I'm not good. I have a poor memory, and I attribute that specifically to being overly universal. Memory is about physical things mostly. You taught me this term, episodic memory, and I was like, oh, my episodic memory isn't that great. And it's probably because I remember universal things okay, but I just don't pay attention to what's going on around me because those are local things. I guess that's a problem, and it's not a non-communication problem. I'm not good with knots. I'm not good at tying ropes. I attribute that to not being local too, I guess.
What are maybe something that your wife is very good at, but you're not, and it's because you're universal?
I'm sure there's a lot of those things. Kinsey, what's something you're better at me than because you're local and I'm extremely universal? Remembering how things look, she says. That's true. I can drive by a building for 30 years and never know that building is there. Ever.
Okay.
I would never, ever, I just don't know those things.
Yeah.
And I attribute that to local.
Okay.
What about you? What do you think? I mean, you're pretty universal. So can you think of anything that you're bad at because you're universal and not a communication issue?
Yeah. Well, I think I'm more local than you. I do think at least I can turn it on more easily than you.
Mm-hmm.
But I do feel like everything I do that's local, I'm bad at. Or at least less good at than an SFP would be.
How are you at sports and movement? How well do you pick up physical activities compared to other people?
That's probably my biggest caveat in life is anything that has to do with physical orientation. I'm bad at physical puzzles. I'm bad at any sport at all, ever. Anything hand-eye coordination related, I'm really bad at. Remembering steps that are required to perform an action. Or even something I've done for years and years and years, I might forget how to do it. So getting coffee in the morning, getting coffee out of our coffee machine. I've done it for years and years, but occasionally I will do a step in the wrong order and have to throw out the whole bunch of coffee again.
Yeah. No, I like that. Reminds me, you mentioned steps. So I think there's a difference in the way that we learn and remember and do things too. And I think this is my bias coming in. I think it's better the way I do things. So I have a bad memory in general. I just have a bad memory. It's hard for me to remember steps, like you were saying. So instead, what I do, instead of remembering, well, I guess I should mention that's a bad example. So there's two ways to be decent at something, at a domain. You can remember and memorize all these advanced concepts that have high utility and use those concepts. But then if something a little off happens, as reality tends to cause happen, that advanced concept that you memorized is all of a sudden not exactly useful in the situation, because the situation is a little different than what your textbook said. And so it doesn't actually quite solve your problem, that advanced concept you remembered. If instead you just remember the universal concepts, just the very basic first principles concepts upon which the entire field is generated and built upon, then you never need to memorize anything, because you can always rebuild everything in your head. If you understand pat down the actual basic principles of the field that you're working in, that's all you need. You don't ever have to memorize anything, because you can always rebuild everything. You can, what's the word? Yeah, you can rebuild everything in your own head.
Okay. Yeah, and I can think of, there's ups and there's downs to that method. If you just remember every step for an individual task, you will be more efficient at that task, because you know every step that needs to be made. If you are taking a concept and trying to use that concept to develop the steps, on the fly, you are less likely to have the most efficient route of action the first time around, until you eventually just remember the steps and you add steps as you go. But if you already have all the steps in mind, it makes things quick. You can just do step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5. So in that sense, local is more efficient in what it does, but it's less transferable. Universal is much more transferable, but it's going to be less efficient at every action it actually takes.
Yeah, I think in the example that I described, that your solutions might be more reliable, but they might take much longer period of time. So depending on the field, you very well might just want to choose a local solution. You just memorize things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's
in
why
fields, really.
That's why any well-balanced person would need to have both universal and local skills. Anyone who tries to just depend on one or the other will not get very far in life, because otherwise you're stuck following steps for your entire life, or you're stuck never looking at your checklist ever and just trying to figure it out as you go. And both of those aren't good choices in every situation.
We have talked about this first bullet point for way too long, probably. So I think the next thing we're going to talk about was how local and universal relate to MBTI. Are we ready for that?
I feel like anyone who knows MBTI probably has already figured out through all this. But we'll just state it anyways. Universal relates to the N functions. So NE and I. And local relates to the S functions. So SE and SI. They're basically the same. MBTI tends to have, or at least MBTI tests I've noticed tend to end with people testing as N a lot more often than what we believe there are actually universal people. But other than that, just like the basic descriptions, they're not too far off in definitions, universal and intuition and local and sensing. Obviously we had issue with the nomenclature. That's why we renamed them to universal and local. How would you define the word intuition, Colby? So unrelated to MBTI.
Oh, unrelated to MBTI. I would say intuition is believing something or feeling something without knowing why or having good justification for it. That's my dictionary definition, I guess.
Yeah, right. And we feel that doesn't describe the set of traits that we're looking at here.
I completely ignore it. I just think,
Yeah. Universal, we feel, is much more fitting here because, universal shows a wide range, and that's what we believe it's describing here. A wide range, high malleability. And the same thing with sensing. Sensing, at least for me, like sensing your physical touch, sight, smell, sound. And while being local might help you in these domains, at least I feel that doesn't describe what local is, at least not fully.
I think there's better words than sensing, but I think sensing is better for local than intuiting is for universal.
Mm-hmm.
Sensing kind of makes sense a little bit because senses are physical, and most of the time local people will be better at sensing things, but it's not great. No, it's not great.
Mm-hmm. Especially anyone with SI. I feel like SI doesn't fit sensing. SE, no, I can see an argument for SE falling under any kind of category you wanted to call sensing, but SI just seems too far off.
Okay, so physical appearance, local versus universal. As we've talked about, the entire point of physiotype is that you can infer people's functions and their type from the way they look, specifically facial features, right? I don't really I think there might be some disagreement between me and Alex here, and I don't have strong opinions about it, but I'm just going to say what I found, and hopefully you can follow up, Alex. I don't really think you can directly infer universalness from the way a person looks. So basically, here are the universal types. NTPs, NTJs, NFJs, and NFPs. So you can infer those 4 types. Is that 4? You can infer those 4 types via other things. So via FE and FI, those have definite physical appearances. INI and
Meta
NI,
and Mesa, which we'll get into in a different episode.
Yeah. So because FE and FI look a certain way and NE and NI look a certain way, that's all you need to type someone is NFJ, NTP, NTJ, and whatever the other one was. So basically, it doesn't matter. So basically, you have to type them via, FE and FI and NE and NI. And then once you do that, they're universal or a local. And that's physically how I would type someone as universal or local. Of course, you can do it by personality as well, but the physical appearance, I don't know that there's any direct thing that I can see to show me that someone's local or universal. What do you think, Alex?
To be honest, I'm still on the fence here. There are things that I used to think related to universal versus local, but like, for example, I think we've discussed before that like the how shiny a person's eyes are, which we've tried to figure out the physical reasons why someone's eyes might appear more shiny versus someone else's, but at the end of the day, we ended up not talking about it much anymore because we realized universal people might have shiny eyes sometimes, but there's also plenty of local people that we've come across that are also have that same attribute. So we've had to throw that to the side.
Yeah, and think of like my brother, a super NI NFJ, extremely heavy NI NFJ. His eyes are not, I guess they are shiny, but they're not like bright.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They're dark and shiny. I don't know. Anyways, as you can see, we don't know what we're talking about. No, it's kidding. I don't know what I'm talking about. Alex knows.
No, I think of all the dichotomies, I think this has probably been the hardest one for us to find any definitive physical attributes for. If there is anything,
but maybe we don't need to.
Yeah, we haven't needed to until now because, like you said, NE and SI, which if you guys remember, a person who has NE will also have SI and vice versa. They have certain physical attributes, and someone who's SE and NI have different physical attributes that we can get into at another time. But knowing that, and then knowing prone versus supine, those are the only two sets of physical attributes that you really ever need to know to be able to type someone. So we've gotten away this far with not having to look too deeply into this.
Okay, so famous examples of universal and local people. So, famous universal example is Jim Carrey, right? He's an NTP, isn't he? So if you look at Jim Carrey recently, he's gotten like really into meditation and spirituality. I guess those aren't very universal things, actually. They can be quite local as well. So never mind. Anyways, he's a universal guy. Abraham Lincoln was a universal.
Yeah. NTP as well.
Christian Bale, universal.
Christian Bale, NTJ. Yeah, good. This category isn't as useful as it was in the last episode just because we didn't give any physical attributes to look at. But yeah. Some locals would be...
Well, NFJs are universal too, so like, we've got so many NFJ actors.
Yeah. Ben Affleck. He's NFJ, if I remember correctly. What about locals? Donald Trump, STP.
Lead singer from System of a Down, STP.
Okay.
Whatever his name is. Serge Tankian, yeah.
Jennifer Lawrence, SFP. Elon Musk, isn't he STJ? I think he's STJ.
Yeah, he's an STJ.
Yeah.
Now that's an interesting one, huh?
That's an example of someone whose type is local, but they're very universal as well.
Yeah, they think fairly universally. Yeah.
It's just another example of how this isn't as clear cut as diagnostic as we might make it sound sometimes.
Yeah, no, honestly, I think the behavioral differences that you see from local versus universal are not as clear as any of the other dichotomies that we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
It's more about like mindset, how you learn, how you think, what you enjoy doing, kind of how you communicate.
The examples we've given have been pretty extreme examples too of local versus universal communication. I think most people will not behave in those extreme fashions that we've demonstrated, but it's easier to see in the extreme examples. It's easier to see the universal in someone who's very universal, and to see the local in someone who's very local.
Even if our listeners don't buy into physiotype, I'm betting it should be fairly obvious that the local universal dichotomy is an extremely useful dichotomy in psychology and in just the study of things in general. This thing is more local. This thing is more universal. Like, these are terms that should be used every day. And there are some, like, esoteric words and fields that kind of, use universal and local language. But these really should be terms that are used in the common vernacular, and they're not. And we really should be on a day-to-day basis talking about things. Oh, this is a more universal thing. This is more local. We just don't talk about this for some reason. So these are definitely extremely useful concepts, even if you don't buy into physiotype.
I think a part of the reason why they're maybe not talked about it as much is because people are going to be less interested in giving a name to the things that they're not interested in than otherwise. Like, I could see myself, if I didn't already know about physiotype or MBTI or any of this stuff, I could see myself just defining things as boring or not boring. Like, and just leaving it at that. And that's not good for communication. But if you're not aware of the fact that there's a communication that needs to be had, then...
One thing I want to bring up, we didn't have this in the bullet points, but I guess this is a fine time, is lots of the time we view universal people as more intelligent. I don't think that there's a correlation between IQ and universal local. Maybe there is, one way or the other, I don't know, but we don't have any strong evidence to support that, and I think it's not great to suggest that either.
Mm-hmm.
So generally just in life, even if people don't know about local and universal, they will tend to think of universal people as more intelligent. Here's the thing, though. A dumb, very universal person is the most useless person on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
Like, a dumb local person can get stuff done. It doesn't matter that they're dumb. We've built this amazing society where IQ hardly matters. Like, it doesn't even matter. Like, as long as you're hardworking and ethical, then you're gonna do okay. So if you're a dumb local person, that's fine. Who cares? But being a dumb universal person, that's really bad because they're useless. Okay, like
I think if a local person is wrong about something, it is more easily correctable by those around them. It's more easy to see what's wrong and for it to be fixed, whether it be by someone else or just by the trial and error of it, because you do something local, either it works or it doesn't. Something that's universal, you can be wrong about it and be very wrong, but because universal concepts don't see the light of day in the same way that local concepts do, there's not a direct action that you're usually able to take without. Do you know what I'm trying to say here?
I know exactly what you're trying to say. May I?
Yeah.
So I think universal truths aren't actually truths. They should be measured. So universal claims should be measured by their utility. And they can only be measured by their utility because they're just inherently false because life isn't universal. However, local claims, local truths can be measured. They can easily be shown to be true or false, and they can be measured as true or false. It's either wrong or it's right. But local claims, local concepts are measured by utility rather than truth or false, and utility is measured by trial and error over years and years and many different circumstances. So yeah, it's harder to prove a universal thing wrong. It's very easy to prove a local thing wrong.
Yeah, right. I think someone can hold on to a universal belief their entire life, and the people around them not realize that they're wrong about that thing. I think it's a lot harder to hold on to a local belief that is incorrect without it getting corrected in some way or shape or form.
Yeah, exactly. Like I believe cars run on water. Easy to prove wrong. I think electric cars are worse for the planet than gasoline cars. Much harder to prove wrong.
Yeah, right.
I don't know whether that's true or not. I have no idea. But I'm just saying those are, it's going to take a lot of work to disprove the second one and very little work to disprove the first. Career examples? I keep on wondering if programming is a local or a universal thing.
Yeah, I know a lot of both that are in programming. Well, you mentioned economists.
All right, why do you think do you think an economist is a fairly universal field?
I think so. Honestly, I don't understand the role of an economist enough to give lots of feedback on that one, though.
I think it is because economists think a lot about principles and rules, things that can be applied to many things. They're always talking about, essentially it's like math mixed with psychology almost. And so the things they build are models. They're really good at models, and those are universal things.
Right. That's good. That's true. Same thing with physics. Pretty much all physics is model building. Like you said, research is typically local. So anyone who's in the research sector of physics, the physics field would probably be, you could probably consider a local field, but the model builders themselves, you would assume to be universal.
But yeah, physicists aren't looking at particles and being like, I'm curious what this particular particle does.
Right.
Because I care about this particle. It's like, yeah, they look at particles and how they interact and what happens. But the reason they do that is because they're trying to build principles which are universal. Which is interesting, right? Because we have to look at local things to build universal principles. Like I said, universal things aren't real.
It's true. Without local, there is no purpose for universal.
It's like, when have we not abstracted from local to get universal things? Very few things I can think of that are purely universal or like just exist as universal beings or things not derived from local observance.
Another field would maybe be...
Mathematicians are fairly universal. Architecture is moderately universal.
Yeah, I think that can go both ways.
Rock climbing rock climbing is very local, right?
Yes.
So basically, all sports are fairly local things, right?
Yeah. And it's not to say that model building isn't useful in sports, but model building is useful at the drawing board when you're planning to play a sport. But in the moment, while it might be good to have a model in your mind already, it's not good to be trying to form a model at that moment. It's like going back to your example with the rock climber telling you to put your right hand in a specific spot. Like, that's great that you're trying to figure out the reason why it's good to put it there, but is that moment really the best time to be sitting back and coming up with a model for something when you're hanging off the ledge of a mountain, you know? Maybe not.
Exactly.
Maybe you should save the model building for later.
Precisely, yeah. That's why I'm not a pro sport person.
That's why there's so many of these football or soccer coaches that are universal. You think, oh, sports, that's the local action, so everyone must be local. But while many of the players are local, and probably more than the average population, most of the coaches, at least in soccer that I've seen, are universal. Lots of NTJs as soccer coaches, because again, the coach's job is while they're playing, but is also off the field when they're planning for their next game. And I don't know tons about soccer, but I know a lot of strategy goes into it behind the scenes.
It's not all just about running fast. So the next thing we're going to talk about is behavior, right? If you weren't talking to someone, Alex, like let's say you weren't able to have a conversation, but you were able to like watch their life. Like let's say someone gave you like a resume of their life. Here's who they married. Here's what they do for a living. Here's their hobbies. Here's like all these things, but you couldn't actually talk to the person or hear. You couldn't hear how they think. You couldn't talk to them, but you could see like all those external things. Is there anything there? Do you think that you could infer whether they're local or universal? Because that's behavior, right? If you can do that, then that's
right. I don't know if I'd be able to infer with a high degree of confidence whether or not they're local or universal type. I would be able to infer whether or not, and we haven't really talked about subtypes much, mostly because we want to talk about it in more detail in a later episode. But I think you could fairly easily infer if there is a lot of universal or if there's a lot of local.
Let's paint a picture, like without dialogue or thought process of the way they learn. So a person who was really into sports growing up became a very good mechanic. Do they have kids or not? I don't know. Probably doesn't matter. Are they married or not? Probably doesn't matter. So I guess if someone who played sports a lot and became a very good mechanic, and I had to guess, I would say local.
And that would be like a nice, clean, clear-cut example. Looking at like my own what resume I would have for myself, like I don't know, someone who and I think this would give a good example of why it's not as clean cut and just easily diagnostical as we've maybe made it sound. Is like if you look at my hobbies, most of my hobbies are fairly local hobbies. I like fishing, I like hiking.
Aren't most hobbies local?
Yeah. That's the thing. Most actions, if not all actions that are taken are going to be local in some way, shape, or form. And unless someone told me, oh, they were a physicist their whole life, something like that. Even like, okay, they're probably universal, but that's just because physics is such a universal field that most, if not all, locals would probably get filtered out by the time you have a master's in physics. But that's a pretty extreme example because I don't think most universals are physicists. Yeah,
so like if I saw someone growing up, they enjoyed what as a universal?
Probably the most universal pastime I have is like playing RTS games. But there's plenty of locals that play RTS games too, so even that's not a very good.
Those things aren't super universal. I mean, they're a little universal for sure. They're just I mean. It's okay, but the fact is, behavior itself doesn't seem to be affected a large amount.
I think you have the easiest time telling if someone is universal or local is by talking to them and seeing where their thought processes come from. If they're chunking up or if they're chunking down when they speak to you. And that's like you said before. Does their mind tend to go in the direction of general principles and less examples, less anecdotal examples? Or is it the opposite? Do they go from something more general and slowly move in a more specific direction? So, effect on society. Colby, what would happen if everybody in a society was universal?
It would fall apart.
Why?
Because most of the things that need to happen to have a successful society are local things. And universal people generally don't like doing local things very much. And so if you don't like doing things, you're probably not going to do it. It would be difficult. We would have less nice things, for sure, if all of us were universals. We might have a lot of models and concepts, but it just might not get done.
Uh-huh.
What do you think?
I think that's true. I think that's very true. And I think a universal doing a local job is going to be far worse at that job. So even if you do have enough workers working on AC units or fixing cars and working on, specific tasks like that, I think they're less likely to be good at those tasks. And I think we're far more likely to have machines that dysfunction because of it.
Well, what would happen if it was all locals?
Honestly, I think society would be a lot better off, to be honest. Like, in both of these examples, I'm thinking like a society full of the most universal people, most universal of the universal, versus a society of like the most local of the local. I still think even then, I'm pretty sure local would be way better off.
I think our universe right now is better than either of those universes. But I don't know which one would be. I don't know if I agree. I don't know. I'll take your word for it. But I certainly think having a mix is the best.
Definitely. Having a mix is definitely the best thing. I think having only locals, we wouldn't have as many nice things either. I think it'd be for a very different reason, though. I think if it's all universals, we wouldn't have nice things because nothing would happen. And if we had all locals, we wouldn't have nice things because things wouldn't change. And usually, and almost every nice thing we have came from a less nice predecessor.
And even local things like vacuuming the house, that was once technology. That was once research. That was once science. That was once physics. Like, every seemingly mundane local thing we have that is a product started because of some concept, some universal math or philosophy or a model that was built. We had to figure out how vacuums actually worked and what air pressure is before we actually built a vacuum cleaner. And that person was probably a fairly universal person because air pressure can exist everywhere in the universe. It's a fairly universal concept because it's just a thing that can happen. We both provide a lot for society.
Yes. Yes. And going back to like how this relates to intelligence, I don't really know a lot about how IQ tests work. I do know that there's
it's a lot of fast pattern recognition and stuff like that.
Okay. And I know a lot of people have felt that IQ tests are not a great indicator of intelligence. And I think a lot of the conflict there comes from defining intelligence. I think a lot of people have a hard time thinking of a good definition for intelligence and what it means to be intelligent. But if I'm going to go with like a super basic definition of intelligent, and say something like just being able to accomplish your goals more effectively, I think the most intelligent person would be someone who's very local and very universal, or who has the ability to think locally and universally. Because without one or the other, you're going to have a lot of gaps in your understanding of how the world works and how to get things done. I think someone who is very universal, and again, it depends on the goals, but would have a lot harder time at accomplishing something than someone who is universal and local, and vice versa. And again, it's hard because, like, how do you define intelligence? But if you're trying to define intelligence by like how utilitarianly useful you can be, then the most intelligent person would be very high in both, I would expect.
I wouldn't necessarily say high in, well, yeah, same thing. I would say just be able to turn it on or off, be able to do both. Yeah, like you said. Yeah, no,
yeah.
that's absolutely true.
I know in my life, I sometimes I look at things that I've done in retrospect that was like a local task, and I'm just like, how could I do something so dumb? And meanwhile, the person next to me was able to do it so easily. Like, I'm trying to think of a specific example right now. I can't, but I know I felt that way.
Me too, many times.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for listening in. If you liked the show, or if you want to tell us how we did or how we can improve, please leave us a review. It helps us, help you, and it's easy to do. Whatever app you're using to listen in, you can leave your review right there. Thanks again, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.